have two distinguished guests to speak to us about that today, and I'll turn it over to them.
Well, good morning. My name is John Windhausen. I head up the Schools, Health, and Libraries Broadband Coalition, or Shelby Coalition. Very proud to have CNIC as a member of our Shelby organization, along with about 15 or 20 other research and education networks from around the country. I'll explain more about it in a minute, but what I would like to do for the next half hour or so before turning it over to Kim is to just run through this amazing set of broadband funding programs that has been appropriated by the United States Congress in the last couple of years. So we're really kind of at an inflection point, or a huge turnaround, or you know, some other dramatic language that can be used. It's very nice to be back here at the CNIC conference. I was here, the first time I came to the CNIC conference, I believe was 14 years ago, when I had written a paper for EDUCAUSE called The Blueprint for Big Broadband. And that turned into a very exciting program in 2009, the BEAD program that you're very familiar with, I'm sure. That was an amazing amount of $4 billion we had to appropriate for building up middle mile and long haul broadband networks around the United States, with a big preference for anchor institutions to be part of those networks. And it's amazing now that we have 10 times that much money coming from the federal government, in addition to all the state money that is coming forward. So this is really an incredibly impressive time. It's very exciting. We are going to solve the digital divide, but it's not as easy as just spending the money. And I'm sure all of you know that there's a lot more to networking than just laying the fiber. It's doing all of the other activities. But there's money available from the federal government, which we'll talk about, for last mile connections. That seemed to be a big preference now for last mile connectivity, for wireless as well as for fiber, for devices, for digital literacy training, to get people connected. So it's really a kind of across the board an incredibly exciting environment to participate in, and these programs are going to be rolling out over the next few years. So I'm going to do my best to summarize a lot of these programs. You may know a lot of this already, but other components you may not, so feel free to ask questions or interrupt me if you have something that you would like me to clarify. Let's see. It's right here. Yes, so just one more moment on our Shelby Coalition. We are a nonprofit public interest advocacy organization based in Washington, D.C. We now have about 320 members from around the United States. That's largely how we fund ourselves, is through membership. Thank you for the applause. We fund ourselves largely through membership dues and our conferences. We have our big annual conference in 2 weeks in the DC area. We started out with funding from the Gates Foundation, and they came to me about 13 years ago about putting this group together to support the BTOP program, and initially we thought it was a short-term project, and now we've turned it into a long-standing institution. Our Gates Foundation funding ended in 2018, and we were able to make the transition to be self-supporting, and we continue to grow. And it's because of support from CNIC and other organizations like yours that we're able to still be here today and be effective advocate for anchor institutions. So that is our mission, by the way. We support broadband not just for the anchor institution, but for the surrounding community. And our goal is for everybody to have a connection, whether it's at the anchor institution or whether it's at home or in the park or at the workplace. With a little turn of phrase that we use to describe our advocacy is that we support building broadband to and through the anchor institution as a cost-effective way to bring affordable broadband to the home. We've had some success and some setbacks, which I'll describe in just a minute. But that is our mission, for everybody to have broadband through the anchor institutions. Here's a quick list of a lot of the funding programs. This is a lot to take in, so I have individual slides on most of these, but this will just give you a flavor for the incredibly productive work. You know, it's very easy to make fun of Congress and to talk about how impractical or that they can't get things done, but in this case, they really have to give Congress some credit here because they did pull together and enacted and appropriated a huge amount of funding. I mentioned $65 billion, maybe I didn't mention, $65 billion in the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act. That was the biggest piece that passed last November, but that wasn't it. There was also the Department of Treasury has a capital projects fund. There's also the Emergency Connectivity Fund going to the FCC for schools and libraries, middle mile funding, tribal connectivity, the BEAD program, the broadband infrastructure, connecting minority communities. This is just an amazing list of different programs. Each one of them has their own insights and wrinkles and strategies that you may like, that you may not like, but there's enough here for just about everybody to potentially participate. So just starting with the biggest program, the BEAD program, this is, as it says, the Broadband Equity, Access, and Deployment, $42.5 billion program. This is focused on last mile connectivity with a preference for fiber, but not exclusively for fiber. I'll get to that in a second. But it's really focused on providing last mile connectivity to the unserved locations, the underserved locations, and then the anchor institutions who do not have gigabit connectivity today. I was very pleased that the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act that created the BEAD program mentions anchor institutions 29 times in that legislation. So I like to think that would not have happened without the Shelby Coalition's advocacy. However, we didn't always get mentioned in the right way. So this is one example where we were placed, anchor institutions were given third priority in the legislation after unserved and underserved locations. That was a disappointment because a lot of the model for the BEAD program came from the Bridge Act that was sponsored by the senator from Colorado, whose name just escaped me. But he had anchor institutions listed, Senator Bennett from Colorado listed anchor institutions as co-secondary along with underserved. And through the legislative process, we got dropped down into third place. However, that's not the end of our advocacy, because our point is that you don't have to treat anchor institutions as third if you can, by serving the schools and libraries and other anchors, it becomes a way to connect the unserved and the underserved. And this gets to our to and through philosophy. So we are now encouraging the states, as they develop their state broadband plans, to think of anchor institutions not as just a third interest group that needs to be satisfied, but rather anchor institutions can be part of the solution to the first priority of getting service to those unserved locations. So if you build that big fiber pipe to connect the school or library, that provides a good middle mile interconnection point that allows you to build off of that to connect the homes around that. That's the philosophy that we are continuing to advocate for in our state work. A few of the other notes here. Broadband mapping is mentioned here, and this is one disappointment with how this is playing out, at least so far. The mapping process is rather messy. I think we've already known that the FCC's prior maps have been undercounting the number of unserved locations, or to put it the other way, the industry has been exaggerating how many homes actually can get service from them. So the old FCC maps were not very good. Congress passed the Broadband Data Act telling the FCC to improve the maps. They've made some improvements, but they still may not be very good. The FCC is going to come out with the maps. They already released the fabric, just identifying the locations without even identifying where the broadband is yet. And they don't have the locations correct. We're hearing a lot of reports, 20–30% of communities or locations aren't represented in the fabric, which is, that's the starting point for building the broadband maps. And if they haven't got the fabric right, question whether the broadband map that comes later is also going to be accurate or not. One other disappointment about the fabric. Apparently, anchor institutions are identified on the fabric, but then they're flagged as being not broadband serviceable locations. So in other words, they're on the map technically, but forget about them. We're not going to count them. I see a nodding head over here, and I haven't seen this fabric because that's another problem. It's not transparent. It's not being made available to the public. You have to be licensed by CostQuest in order to be able to get access to that fabric. But there still seem to be some difficulties. And I think NTIA realizes that because they've decided not to use, when the maps come out in November, NTIA is saying they're not going to use that version of the map. They're going to wait for the next version of the map to come out in maybe April, May of 2022 before they make their allocations to the states. So there are two reasons the FCC maps are important. One is to allocate money to the states based on the number of unserved locations in that state. That's fine. That's a good exercise to go through. It's a reasonable thing to do. The second purpose is for the FCC maps are supposed to tell you where you should invest your network dollars to connect those unserved and underserved households and anchor institutions. I don't think the FCC maps are going to be any good for that. And I'll just throw on the table the observation and invite anybody to push back at me, that after the FCC maps are used to allocate the money for the states, it could be that the FCC maps are irrelevant after that. Because so many of these decisions, better maps are being done by states and localities. And they're gathering more raw data, more on the ground, boots on the ground information about where the maps, where the broadband does exist and does not exist. So I hate to say it because the FCC is putting a lot of energy into creating these maps. But at the end of the day, I hope that the states and NTIA recognize that the state and local maps are a much higher quality project. There is a preference for open access. Yay, we like open access. We think that creates greater competition for retail services. Municipals are eligible, and as are research and education networks. And that was part of one of our successes. The legislation does allow nonprofits and governmental entities to be eligible to obtain this funding. And middle mile expenses are potentially fundable through the BEAD program, not just through the middle mile $1 billion. I know the $1 billion was very small. Here, credit to all of you who are working on middle mile in California. You've got over $3 billion just in the state for middle mile. That should have sent a signal to Congress to appropriate more money for the middle mile bucket, and they didn't do so. But they did say that middle mile expenses can be counted in the BEAD program if it's necessary for the last mile connection. So that's a little bit about the BEAD program. The Digital Equity Act was another initiative that Shelby has supported right from the beginning when it was introduced 2 years ago by Senator Patty Murray from Washington State. This explicitly provides funding for community organizations, including anchor institutions, to engage in digital literacy training and to engage in other outreach efforts to help people subscribe to broadband. It's not a build it and they will come kind of mentality. This specifically has programs meant to help communities help their constituencies get connected by providing them the resources to do so. Having said that, the money from both the BEAD and the Digital Equity Act is still a year and a half or so away from actually being delivered, and the money is not going to be rolling out the door yet for quite some time because the states have to do their state broadband plans first. So the NTIA is now giving out planning grants to states to develop those digital equity plans and state broadband deployment plans. So we've got to go through that state planning process before the money will be actually awarded. That's under the Digital Equity Act and the BEAD program. Oh, there, I talked over my own slide. Here's the state broadband plans scenario. So as I mentioned, we are continuing to advocate that the state broadband plans should embrace our to and through philosophy as they develop their broadband plans, and we think there's an opportunity for that, particularly because the legislation already requires open access and interconnection. So then it makes a lot of sense to use that and build off of the anchor institution broadband to reach the home. There is an issue with the Buy America waiver. You know, the legislation was well intended and says we want to source a lot of these electronics and manufacture these technologies here in the United States. which I think everybody agrees with. That's a good goal. The problem is we're not really well suited to accomplish that right now. And if you have to develop, I think the legislation says it has to be 55% of the contents of any electronics that are purchased with federal funds has to be sourced in the United States. Well, we're very far away from that right now. A lot of projects would be on hold if NTIA enforces that strict rule. So we've asked NTIA to waive the rule for a certain amount of time, and the latest indications are NTIA is strongly considering giving that waiver. So we hope so, because we want to jumpstart these investments and get the balls rolling. The Middle Mile program, I mentioned it's way too small, but at least it's something. The applications are going in just in a few days from now. We suspect that the number of applications are going to ask for 2 or 3 or 4 times more money than the $1 billion that's been appropriated to Congress or by Congress for this program. So that continues to be a need. And maybe that's something that we can come back to Congress and ask for more funding once that program doles out its availability. Connecting minority communities. This is another exciting program. It's very small, but it's very consistent with the presentations that we just heard. And by the way, kudos to CNIC and for Internet 2 for all the great work that you've been doing to help promote connectivity for HBCUs and other minority-serving institutions. That's something Shelby really applauds and would like to support. In particular, we are supporting this funding program that is $268 million for HBCUs to build broadband. This is the government program that comes closest to articulating our to and through philosophy. Because if you look at the legislative language, it specifically calls for broadband not just on the grounds of the institution, but also for the students who are living around the institution to be eligible to get that broadband. It's a little bit slow in the rollout, so this is a pilot. We're hoping maybe a year from now we can go back to Congress and point to the fact that it's been very successful and get some more money appropriated to support this program. But it's a little premature to be able to say that we need more money for it now because it's still going through the process. The Treasury Department got a capital projects fund of $10 billion. This came in the American Recovery Plan Act over a year ago. So unlike a couple of things about this capital projects fund, it is for broadband, $10 billion. It's not only for broadband, it could also be used for digital equity work, can also be used to constructing community facilities, and like buildings, like library buildings are eligible to be used, So that's interesting. It's also interesting that it doesn't depend on the FCC maps. So they are going forward to the Treasury Department in issuing awards to states, and there have been 3 blocks of money, now 3 announcements really, 3 press releases identifying the states that have received their money so far. I'm very proud, because I'm from New Hampshire originally, that New Hampshire is the first state to get 2 awards from the Capital Projects Fund, and the first one and the third one. It actually, even though I'm saying I'm proud, it doesn't mean all that much, because every state gets their allocation. It just means New Hampshire is getting their allocation earlier than the other states, but all the states will get their allocation of funding through this program. But it's really a wonderful program because it promotes telemedicine, specifically for telemedicine and education and for workforce development. You have to achieve those goals or talk about how you're achieving those goals as you're spending this money. But for the most part, the states are using this money for broadband, and they're using other money, ESSER money and other things for the educational components. The emergency broadband benefit, and it's been superseded by the Affordable Connectivity Program. These are the low-income subsidies for poorer families who need financial assistance to subscribe to broadband. These are very worthwhile. The amount of the subsidy is $30 per month, which seemed like it was not enough at first, and then the Biden administration twisted the arms of about 10 of the largest ISPs and convinced them to offer a $30 a month package of services. So theoretically, consumers can sign up for the $30 a month service package and then get $30 subsidy from the federal government so they don't have to pay anything net. So this is wonderful. It's been growing. There are now 13 million households that are getting money from this ACP program, but it's not going to last forever. $14 billion was appropriated for this program, and that sounds like a lot of money, but if you do the math at 13 million broadband connections, $30 a month, that money is going to last about 3 years. So that's not bad. That's certainly wonderful, but it's not forever. And then the question is, what do you do when those 3 years end and the money runs out? Do those consumers, are they left high and dry without that subsidy anymore? And to make matters even a little bit more urgent, there's also the Emergency Connectivity Fund, a separate subsidy program very much designed the same way to address the low-income consumers' broadband needs, but that money goes through the schools and libraries. And $7 billion was appropriated for the ECF program. That money is going to run out next year. And what happens when these 7 million broadband consumers who are now getting funding from this ECF program lose that funding? Well, then they may switch over to the ACP program. And that means the ACP program will run out of money faster than the 3 years. So we could be talking 2 years from now when this money runs out, all of it runs out, and then we need a replacement for that. So what is that going to lead to? We don't quite know what Congress has in mind, but we're setting this up now. We're having those discussions with members of Congress, say, let's put some plans together, let's prepare for this. Let's not be caught short-handed. Just a quick note about this, the Rural Health Care Program. This is not a congressionally appropriated program. So it's a little bit of a misnomer for me to put it on this list, but it is pretty important for those who are involved in rural health care. The Shelby Coalition has been asking the FCC to ramp up and reform the rural health care program. We have had some success. It used to be capped at $400 million. We got it up to about $700 million per year now. The FCC put out a new notice of proposed rulemaking earlier to upgrade the program further, and here are some of the ideas that we put together that we sent to the FCC to try to provide more funding for this program. The FCC hasn't acted on our comments or acted on the rulemaking petition yet, but if you are interested in working with us to try to upgrade and make more funding available for rural health care, we would love to work with you. The Universal Service Program as a whole is facing some pretty big challenges. And now again, I'm departing from congressional language to talk about what's happening at the FCC. The Universal Service Fund contribution factor has been growing by leaps and bounds, and it's really getting out of control. It's been over 30% a couple of times in the last couple of years. I think it's settled a little bit down to about 28% now, but it's probably going to go back up to 30 and maybe 40% in the next few years. It's kind of a vicious cycle where the bigger the tax you put on telecom services, the more people try to avoid that tax, and they shift their usage to broadband services, which don't pay into the Universal Service Fund. So this is kind of a mismatch, right? Because you're taxing old-fashioned telephone service to pay for the new broadband stuff, but broadband doesn't have to pay into this fund. So the Shelby Coalition, along with some allies, Encompass and NTIA, the rural telcos, we've jointly been trying to advocate to the FCC to change this contribution mechanism in order to assess broadband services too. If you include broadband services in the mix, the percentage factor or tax, it would go down from 30% to less than 4%. So that, in our view, makes so much more sense. It's a much more stable system to collect universal service money for the long run. But the FCC seems to be very gun-shy about doing anything on this. We know California is doing something exciting by establishing a mechanism to raise universal service funds through connections. I think that's a very worthwhile approach. I congratulate the California PUC for moving down that road. We wish the FCC would follow that example and do something similar to preserve the Universal Service Fund going forward. Let me do a time check here. Let's see. I'm okay? So Universal Service Fund is also something that we're very concerned about not just the contribution mechanism, but then there's another kind of a sleeper problem for the Universal Service Fund. And that's a court case that has been filed by libertarian organizations that are trying to challenge the entire administrative state, not just for the FCC, but for the country as a whole. But they've taken on this challenge of the Universal Service Fund as the latest example of their efforts to try to get the federal government to back away from these programs, which we think is a horrible idea. So we intervened to try to defend the FCC and to support the continued funding of the Universal Service Fund. But this, we have a real risk of losing this case, and not because of our advocacy is lousy, it's because the petitioners forum shopped, and they chose first the Sixth Circuit Court of Appeals, and then they changed their minds and went to the Fifth Circuit Court of Appeals. They found six circuits that they think would be most amenable to overturning the entire Universal Service Program. So we're expecting a decision in this in spring of next year, and if they find that the whole Universal Service Fund is unconstitutional, we've got a huge problem on our hands, because the FCC's Universal Service Fund is about a $9 billion program every year that funds local telcos, Lifeline program, E-rate program, rural health care. All of those programs could come to an end if this court case goes the wrong way. So we are working now on alternatives. If we lose this case, do we take it to the Supreme Court? Do we ask for a stay? Do we ask Congress for some emergency legislation just to keep things running while the court process continues on? But this is very dangerous. And there are a lot of reasons why it doesn't make any sense to bring this constitutional challenge 25 years after the Universal Service Fund was created by Congress. But nonetheless, this court may have some sympathy for that approach. Now, everything that I've talked about this enormous amount of funding for broadband network deployment and construction, and for the ongoing subsidies for low-income people, could be solved by a very easy, simple solution of enabling anchor institutions to self-deploy their own wireless networks. We have been articulating, again, as a part of our to and through idea, that it would be wonderful in schools and libraries and higher education and community centers, anybody who's got a presence in the community, if they have a fiber going to that building, put an antenna on the roof or out into the community and provide wireless connectivity. And you can now use CBRS spectrum or Wi-Fi spectrum, depending on the configuration of your community and the engineering, to provide free wireless access service to millions of households from the anchor institution. We just sponsored a study that was released last month, and it was written by, we hired Dr. Raoul Katz to do the study. He's a professor at Columbia University. And he's done a lot of international work, a lot of domestic work too. He's really a wireless expert. And he provided a cost model and identified this, and he compared basically how much would it cost to deploy wireless service from a traditional wireless company like T-Mobile, Verizon, or AT&T using hotspots versus if a school or library or other anchor institution deployed this technology on its own or worked with a private sector company to deploy it. And the self-provisioning option is so much cheaper than buying hotspots from a traditional provider, like 1/5 the cost, sometimes 1/10 of the cost. So you could connect so many more households if you were to enable anchor institutions to play this role of bringing that wireless connectivity to the home. The E-rate program, however, doesn't allow you to do this today. And the ECF program that I mentioned earlier had a big preference for hotspots because it was influenced by those traditional wireless companies. So we are now talking to Congress about if we can get more money for the ECF program, first we need to call it something else because we're not in an emergency. But also let's think about restructuring the program to allow some of these other anchor-enabled networks to be part of the solution and not give that preference for hotspots in the future. So, time to go. Yes, okay, thank you for that note. I'll just mention quickly, we've got a new bill that was just introduced to devote auction revenues to help support the digital divide. We're hoping that moves forward. A quick note about the FCC. Gigi Sohn, I provided here. Here's an update on her nomination. It's blank because nothing is happening. That's stalled. It's really unfortunate. And here's my contact information. I welcome your questions. Thank you very much.
Great, thank you, John, for all of that good information. My name is Kim Lewis, and I am the Director of Government Affairs for CNIC, and really pleased to be here. As he noted, there has been so much going on, so much attention to broadband. I would really be remiss if I didn't spend a little bit of time talking about California's historic actions from last year, where we passed SB 156, which is a budget trailer bill, if you're aware of the budget process, which enabled a lot of reforms and supports and dedicated $6 billion in funding from a combination of some of the federal funds that John talked about, as well as with some of our state general fund. If you've been following California's budget process, we have been in a surplus for quite some time, hitting $100 billion in surplus funding, which means infrastructure projects are really a great use of those one-time dollars. And so through last year's budget process, we put in $3.25 billion towards creating a middle mile, which CNIC was selected as a third-party administrator to create, construct, develop, manage the middle mile network, which is under the auspices of our Golden State Net entity. We also dedicated $2 billion to be allocated towards serving that last mile problem, with $1 billion being split between our rural communities and $1 billion being split amongst our underserved, more urban kind of areas. And then we did a unique thing where we put $750 million towards creating this loan loss account, which many of our local government partners through RCRC were really advocating for as a more cost-effective way for them to be able to capitalize on dollars to build out their own local networks, and creating a municipal bond approach to solving broadband in their communities. There was some additional reforms to our California Advanced Services Fund, which I'll talk about in a little bit, and added some key components around accountability and oversight and the creation of a Middle Mile Advisory Committee. But then this year, after a lot of the work that's been going on through Golden State Net, the administration and the legislature agreed to commit an additional $550 million towards the Middle Mile project starting for next year, so the next 2 fiscal years, and as you can see in the bottom, the split between those and general fund resources. I would note that the federal funds have a very ambitious timeline where funding is expected to be encumbered by the end of 2024 and fully exhausted by the end of 2026. So very, very tight timelines in terms of actually trying to move things forward in a big state like California, but we're very excited about all this opportunity and where the state is committed to really having that vision of broadband for all. So as California has always kind of been a little bit of a leader when it comes to what we do in our public purpose programs, and one of our unique ones that we have is the California Advanced Services Fund, which is funded through a surcharge on those phone bills, and to really support broadband infrastructure builds for last mile projects in our communities. And it's been something we've been doing for a while. Last year we had legislation that continued to extend that surcharge collection process and some reforms through a couple of bills, AB 14 and SB 4, that really helped continue that program, and it will be there ongoing for another 10 years. So even though when federal funds may run out, we will still have a mechanism in California to be able to really support continued broadband infrastructure deployment. This fund also actually does some other things, not just infrastructure. It also supports adoption accounts. It funds our regional broadband consortia for those of you who participate in those entities. And it also has a public housing account to help support and bring broadband into our public housing projects so that our lower income Californians also have robust broadband in the houses that they live in. And there's a lot of activity I wanted to talk about. It's been a few years since we've had a ton of broadband legislation going through the legislature, and this has been one of those years given the investments that the state has been making through SB 156. And we're looking at some potential additional changes to the California Advanced Services Fund. I listed AB 2749 on here and AB 1426 just to put on your awareness, because we have something weird in California when you have legislation going through and they may amend the same section. So if you were to look at the Mathis bill, it may look very similar to the Quirk-Silva bill. And we want to ensure that we don't chapter each other out when they go into effect. So just noting this, we have chaptering out legislation, so that's why these two are on here, even though if you were to actually look them up, they would look very similar today. And it's just more to prevent that the actual change doesn't go away and it isn't misconstrued. So we'll see where the governor has actually until the end of this week on September 30th to take action on all the bills that the legislature has sent to him. So September 30th is our drop dead deadline for him to sign or veto. And there's still about 556 bills that are pending his action by Friday. So that's a lot for him to get through. So I expect a lot of activity and updates that will be happening, so hence the pending. He has not acted on any of the broadband legislation as of last night when I last checked, and nothing this morning. So I don't have any late breaking news, unfortunately, for you on any of this, but maybe we will by the end of conference. And then a couple other things that I wanted to flag that I think have gotten the legislature's attention, and in terms of what John was talking about, in terms of the actions at the federal level and where we're moving. You know, the legislature wants to ensure that we are not missing these opportunities and that the California Department of Technology is acting and creating a state digital equity plan. And I will say that they did submit one in July, and so we are pending their action and whether or not we get funded, which I assume would likely be the case. Obviously, I can't predict what the feds will do, but likelihood is very highly probable. And it's for $4 million to do some of this planning work. We have a bill by Assemblymember Jim Wood that's focusing on trying to improve some of the mapping and data collection. As you know, as John talked about, the maps are always a big challenge when it comes to identifying locations for where we want to ensure that we have build out of broadband and that we are not missing things. It's always a question of, if we're not on the ground, how do we know that you actually have connectivity and services? And so this is to make it very clear from a legal statutory authority that the PUC has to be able to collect this level of broadband subscription data. And then finally, we have a bill by Senator Dodd, which is really around broadband reporting activities and trying to identify what are those barriers to deployment and services. This is what we call a gut and amend piece of proposal. So you may not have caught it early in the session because in May of this year, it was gutted and amended to be something totally different to what it is today and what went before the governor. So as I said, we will see by the end of the week what happens on these activities. I think there has been a lot of commentary in the governor's veto messages that the legislature sent bills to his desk that cost $20 billion, and a lot of it was not contemplated or funded through the budget process. And so that has been the basis for many of his veto messages, is that there wasn't resources to support the actions that the legislature were considering. But for those of you who are really interested and engaged in learning and tracking what the state's working on, I wanted to highlight a lot around the governor's vision for broadband for all, for a California for all is really his vision and equity. The California Broadband Council has been around for many years. It was by our former state senator, Alex Padilla, who is now at the congressional level and working at the federal for us. And this is a place where it meets around quarterly to 3 times a year, and we have partners from many of our segments, such as the Department of Education, representatives on that, State Library, and others who participate in this forum. And their next meeting will actually be October 12th, later this next month. So if you're interested, this is definitely a place where you want to track, you want to follow, want to hear what's going on. And then we also have the Middle Mile Advisory Committee. So this committee was created, as I noted, as part of SB 156. And it's really to be an oversight and advisory committee on the development of the Middle Mile project. We do have legislation also authored by Assemblywoman Cork Silva that contemplates actually expanding the composition of this commission to add 2 more seats for local government representation. And this is also being considered by the governor, and so we'll see whether or not he expands that access. And then maybe something else some of you have paid attention to or caught notice of is that there is a Broadband for All portal platform, and there have been some Broadband for All roundtables. There have been 4 so far this year, back in April and May, where partners were invited, community-based organizations, a lot of our schools, our libraries, to kind of weigh in on the process of how do we, connect in terms of improving broadband deployment, adoption, and equity in this state. And so this is part of the planning process that the Department of Technology is putting forward. And we've really seen a lot of expansion in terms of broadband authority for the Department of Technology, where we have, a lot of folks working on this. They've been the lead at the Broadband Council, but then we also have our Public Utilities Commission, which handles a lot of our telecommunications side of the house. So we're seeing a lot of expansion for broadband activity at CDT, while we're seeing the PUCs staying focused on a lot of the telecom carrier-specific work, but still partnering together. This is a lot of work in collaboration between the two. And so I did want to take a moment to talk about the Public Utilities Commission because I think it's important that you're aware. I think since the last time we met, there's been 3 people who've changed on this commission. We have President Alice Reynolds, who actually comes from the governor's office, who's now leading it. We also have Cliff Reschenchild, who's actually termed out in January. So we will see if there's actually going to be another appointment for this commission and a new face, or whether or not Cliff will seek a second term, which he could happen as well. So I think there's a lot of questions out there, and some of the commissioners we work with, Martha, who's no longer here and working at the federal level to do some work there. And the PUC is taking the lead on all the BEAD work that John talked about. So this is why both agencies are really working in partnership and collaboration together to ensure that we are moving forward with this work. And Commissioner Darcy Hook, I would say, is kind of stepping into Martha's role and taking lead on some of these broadband telecommunication proceedings that are occurring. There's been a lot of activity at the commission around rulemakings that impact broadband, where some of the mapping work has been done for the Middle Mile project, as well as a lot of work that's happening in terms of service quality, general order changes, and the federal funding account, which is where, for those of you who are interested in last mile projects, that's all managed under the Public Utilities Commission. There is currently actually some technical assistance grants that are open and available for folks to apply for, including our tribal partners, so it's not just limited to kind of those you would traditionally think of as being accessible for some of the state funding, but really trying to support folks in terms of their broadband thinking, deployment, and also being thoughtful around moving broadband across contiguous counties, because as you know, broadband doesn't just stop at political boundaries, right? We look at the Quilts map that Larry put up, and this is not just limited to the U.S. It is an international, global network, and so making sure that there is connectivity to and through, not just anchors, but through communities. So we want to make sure that we're building those pieces into it and looking broader. I did want to take a couple minutes to talk about what's kind of going on. I'm assuming you've been bombarded with a lot of political ads going on. It is getting into campaign season, which typically kicks off right after Labor Day. We don't normally have this conference so close to elections, so I thought it would be a really kind of neat time to talk about it and just put a plug for all of you to be registered to vote, and I would just say that. And if you haven't, talk to me, I'll help you out. But November 8th is going to be a big election this year. We had also with the census that led to redistricting. So a lot of changes in political boundaries when it comes to members who are elected officials, whether it's at the state level or federal level. And what we're seeing with that is actually a huge changeover this coming year with term limits actually impacting because, we passed a proposition a couple years ago saying that people could serve 12 years in whichever house they wanted to. So they could serve all 12 years in the Assembly, all 12 years in the Senate, and they would be done. And so coupled with redistricting, we have seen actually some members choose to retire early and not seek a new term. For example, Assemblymember Mark Stone, who represents actually the district we are in and where we are today, is actually not seeking re-election because of this. So I think there's a lot of different elements that we're going to have, and from an educational standpoint, a lot of new people to educate. So you're talking about a third of the California State Legislature that may not be aware of what you do and the importance of the value of broadband and in their communities. They have maybe the very high level, surface level understanding, and so kind of as Ilke was talking about, how do we go deep with these folks and get them to understand that it is broader than just flipping a switch and turning it on, right? So we have to do a lot more around that. What we're also going to be seeing is a lot of change in leadership. So the Speaker and the Pro Tem, who are running both the Assembly and Senate, will be hitting the end of their term at the end of this coming session. So at some point there's going to have to be new leadership by nature. There's already been a chance of a member trying to do that in the Assembly side this year, so I think it'll only become more active in this coming year. And typically what we also see then is also new members stepping up and taking on new committees. We have Senator Hueso, who's been the Senate Energy Chair for a while, who will be terming out and not running, so we'll have a new leader in that committee. So lots of changes that are really happening, and I wanted to be on your awareness. And I also think just from like a makeup of the legislature, the Republicans are actually going to be fairly lucky if they get 15 Republicans coming back in the Assembly. Redistricting has not gone well for them, and I think they're just simply disappearing a little bit. There may be some contested races in a few places, but it's not going to change the supermajority that the Democrats have in California's legislature. So I think just from an awareness standpoint, again, it's going to be a lot of educating because I can see a lot of people wanting to do things in the long term, and so we have to bring them along and understand what it really takes to make all of this happen and make it all come together. And then lastly, I think another key thing that I would put on your radar that's a good tell of where California's fiscal estimates are is our Legislative Analyst Office, which is a nonpartisan research entity that really supports the legislature in their work, who drives a lot of the fiscal forecasting, will publish their update this coming November. And that's usually a good indicator of whether we're going to actually have a lot of money to spend next year or not. I think where we're seeing early indications from cash revenues and monthly reports is that things are lower than we expected. So it feels like, and part of what the governor's maybe messaging is on vetoes around this is that brace yourselves, we've had a lot of prosperity for a while, but it may not be that way going forward. So we really need to be cognizant, and how that impacts everyone's budget across all of our segments is yet to be seen. So I think, when that comes out in November, I definitely would read it because I think it'll help you understand where your leadership's, where your administration is coming from, and what we can be possible to do in the forthcoming year. And then finally, we have been getting a ton of questions around what is middle mile, and I think the most obvious publication for a long time has been the Benton Report, Foundation Report for a while around what middle mile is, and I think because of all the inquiry and interest we have had from our members, we wanted to put out a sweet series of short one-sheets that you can share with your folks around what middle mile is. And if you checked your email this morning, you would have realized 2 more of our new ones came out today. So I also wanted to note that we did bring actually paper copies for you, and they're at the front here if you wanted to pick them up, but they are also always available on our website because we're a beautiful comms team who does fabulous work in terms of pulling it all together. And so I think that puts me at where I'm at for my time, and just wanted to say thank you for the opportunity to present here today.
Okay, everybody. So we're now on a break, and that means we've got a couple of opportunities. We have Meet the Speakers, where you can stay in the room here and have a chat with the speakers. That includes this group here and our previous plenary panel. We also have Talk to a Scenic Engineer out on the foyer. You can grab a cup of coffee and go talk to one of the engineers. That's a great opportunity. And of course, we'll have coffee and tea in the main area there. And I would encourage everybody to stop by and have a chat with the vendors if you have the time. So we meet back here in, what, Leanne, 45 minutes? 11:50. So,
There's sessions in all three rooms.
right, so now we move to a breakout. So we have sessions next door in the main area here and then in this room over here. So if you haven't already downloaded the Crowd Compass application to figure out which room you want to be in, I'd encourage you to do that and go enjoy a little bit of a coffee break.